The air beside the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had gone down. Heat rested softly inside the mud brick walls of the sleeping city, trapped there from the long desert day. Far above the dark riverbanks, the sky opened wide and clear, filled with quiet stars that seemed to hang over the earth without moving at all. The water moved slowly below them, making only the gentlest sound as it touched the reeds near the shore. In the narrow streets beside the temples, most people had already gone to sleep. Bakers rested beside cooling ovens. Fishermen stretched out on woven mats after long hours on the river. Laborers slept near unfinished walls where dust still clung to their skin and hair. Somewhere in the distance, a tired donkey shifted its weight against wooden posts. Sand moved softly through empty roads with the night wind. And inside the great temples of ancient Egypt, another kind of work was only beginning. The lamps had to be lit. Not all at once. Not quickly. The work moved slowly through the dark stone halls, one flame at a time. A servant carrying a small clay bowl of oil walked carefully across smooth floors worn down by thousands of feet over many generations. His sandals made almost no sound against the stone. In his other hand, he carried a thin burning taper whose flame bent gently whenever cooler air drifted through the corridors. The temple around him smelled faintly of smoke, warm stone, old incense, and oil pressed from plants gathered along the riverbanks. Tall columns disappeared upward into darkness where painted ceilings could barely be seen at night. The gods carved into the walls watched silently from the shadows. Their faces flickered softly whenever a new lamp came alive. The servant stopped beside a low stone stand. Upon it rested a small lamp made from clay blackened by years of use. He poured fresh oil carefully into its shallow center. Then he lowered the tiny flame toward the waiting wick. A small glow appeared. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden. Only a quiet little circle of light blooming gently in the darkness. Then he moved farther into the temple. This was how many nights began in ancient Egypt. Far from the grand ceremonies remembered by later generations, much of temple life depended on ordinary routines repeated slowly every single day. Lamps needed cleaning. Floors needed sweeping. Water needed carrying. Ashes needed removing. Linen needed washing. The great stone temples, though sacred and enormous, survived because countless workers quietly performed small tasks from sunrise until deep into the night. Many of these workers were nearly invisible in the written records left behind. Scribes sometimes noted grain supplies, oil deliveries, or labor assignments, but the people themselves often passed through history without names. Still, they were always there. Young boys carrying jars of oil from storage rooms. Elderly caretakers trimming lamp wicks with careful fingers. Women grinding grain for temple bread before dawn. Guards standing silently beneath gate towers while desert winds blew dust across the courtyards. The temples themselves rose from the earth like small stone cities. During daylight hours they could feel crowded and busy. Priests crossed shaded courtyards carrying offerings. Scribes bent over wooden boards covered in ink. Servants hurried between kitchens and storerooms. Sacred animals rested inside enclosed spaces cooled by thick walls. Visitors arrived from nearby villages carrying baskets of onions, barley, figs, fish, or woven cloth as gifts to the gods. But nighttime changed the temples completely. Once the sun disappeared behind the western desert hills, shadows slowly filled the open courts. The heat softened little by little. Birds tucked themselves beneath roof edges and palm branches. Even the sound of voices became quieter. The stone seemed to hold silence differently after dark. Yet inside the deepest halls, the lamps continued to burn. Keeping those lamps alive required steady work. Oil did not appear magically. It came from fields, harvests, crushing stones, storage jars, transport boats, and sweating laborers. Some oils were made from sesame or castor plants. Others came from animal fat. Every drop represented hours of human effort beneath the hot Egyptian sun. Farmers worked heavy soil near the Nile floodplains while insects gathered around wet earth. Their feet sank into mud as they planted crops row by row beneath endless sunlight. Water carriers moved carefully along narrow banks, balancing jars across their shoulders. Workers harvested plants with curved blades while sweat darkened their linen clothing. The smell of cut reeds and damp soil filled the air around them. Later, others pressed the harvested plants beneath heavy stones to extract oil. Thick wooden beams creaked slowly during the process. Workers leaned their body weight against handles hour after hour while flies drifted lazily through the warm rooms. Oil collected gradually into waiting containers. Then scribes measured the amounts carefully because temples tracked nearly everything. Nothing inside an Egyptian temple truly stood alone. A lamp burning quietly at midnight depended upon entire systems of labor stretching outward into farms, workshops, boats, roads, storage chambers, kitchens, and crowded riverside villages. And still the work remained humble. Inside one temple storeroom, rows of clay jars rested in darkness against cool walls. Their rounded shapes lined the room from floor to ceiling. Some held grain. Others contained dried herbs, wine, honey, incense, or lamp oil. A single caretaker sat nearby on a low stool, rubbing sleep from his eyes while watching over the supplies. His shift would continue until dawn. Occasionally he adjusted a nearby flame or chased away a rat searching for food among the baskets. Outside, the Nile moved silently beneath the moonlight. The river shaped nearly every part of Egyptian life. During the flood season, water spread slowly across fields and left behind rich dark soil once it retreated. Farmers waited carefully for these cycles. Villages planned around them. Temples depended on them. Even the oil used in sacred lamps was connected to the patient rhythm of the river. At night the Nile could feel strangely endless. Boat lanterns drifted far away like floating stars moving across black water. Oars dipped quietly beneath the surface. Fishermen checked woven traps while trying not to wake sleeping children curled beside nets inside the boats. Frogs called from marsh grasses. Insects hummed softly over shallow water pools left by the flooding river. Along the riverbanks, clusters of mud brick homes settled into darkness. Most houses were small and close together, built to shield families from heat and blowing sand. Roofs were often flat, allowing people to sleep outside during especially hot nights. Families rested beneath thin blankets while cooler air finally moved through the city after sunset. A mother might wake briefly to comfort a restless child. Somewhere nearby, an elderly man coughed softly in his sleep. Dogs wandered narrow alleyways searching for scraps beside cold cooking fires. The smell of bread baked earlier in the day still lingered faintly in the warm night air. And beyond those sleeping neighborhoods, the temples glowed softly against the darkness. Their lamps were never meant to create bright light. Ancient temples remained dim places even when fully illuminated. Light flickered gently across carved walls, leaving much of the great halls hidden in shadow. Priests and workers moved carefully through spaces they knew by memory. Their hands brushed familiar stone surfaces polished smooth over many years. One young temple servant named Hori had begun learning these nighttime duties only a few months earlier. He was perhaps 13 years old, thin from constant labor, with tired eyes that struggled to stay open during the deepest hours before dawn. His father had once worked in temple gardens growing herbs used for medicines and incense. Now Hori carried oil jars through the corridors each evening beneath the watchful eyes of older caretakers. At first he feared the darkness inside the temple. The enormous statues seemed alive at night. Animal-headed gods stared downward from pillars while shadows shifted strangely across painted walls. Sometimes wind moved through hidden passageways and created low sounds deep inside the stone chambers. Hori often imagined unseen footsteps ahead of him. But gradually the temple became familiar. He learned where cool air entered certain hallways after midnight. He learned which lamps burned oil too quickly. He learned how to trim a wick so smoke would not stain the ceilings above. He learned which priests preferred brighter lamps near certain shrines and which preferred darkness. Most importantly, he learned patience. Temple work rarely moved quickly. Everything followed routines repeated over generations. Oil poured slowly. Floors swept slowly. Bread baked slowly. Linen folded slowly. Scribes wrote carefully with steady hands. Even prayers often rose and faded in long measured rhythms. The entire world inside the temple seemed to breathe slowly. Near one inner sanctuary, an older priest sat alone beside a low flame reading sacred words from a scroll. His back ached from age. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. Outside the chamber, younger servants waited silently beside stone walls while holding baskets of supplies. The smell of papyrus, oil smoke, and incense drifted through the still air. The priest paused often while reading. Sometimes he simply listened to the silence around him. Temples in ancient Egypt were not always loud places filled with ceremony. Much of temple life involved waiting. Waiting for sunrise rituals. Waiting for deliveries from the river docks. Waiting for sacred festivals. Waiting for cooler air after brutal afternoons. Waiting for illness to pass through crowded worker quarters. Waiting for flood waters to rise again. People rested whenever they could. In shaded courtyards during midday heat, workers often leaned against pillars and closed their eyes briefly before returning to labor. Kitchen servants sat together near ovens after long hours preparing food. Guards rested spears across their knees while fighting sleep during late watches. The heavy Egyptian heat settled into muscles and bones, making even simple movement feel slow. By nighttime, exhaustion touched nearly everyone. A group of stone workers sleeping near unfinished temple walls shifted quietly beneath thin blankets spread across the ground. Their hands remained rough from hauling limestone blocks beneath the burning sun. Dust filled the lines of their skin. Earlier that day they had dragged heavy sledges while overseers shouted instructions through clouds of drifting sand. Now they slept deeply beneath the stars while faint temple light flickered nearby. One man dreamed of cool water. Another dreamed of bread fresh from the oven. Another simply slept without dreams at all. Farther inside the temple kitchens, a woman named Tia prepared dough for morning bread before dawn arrived. Her arms moved slowly through large clay mixing bowls while nearby lamps cast warm circles across the walls. She worked beside other women who spoke quietly to avoid waking children sleeping in an adjoining room. Temple kitchens never truly rested. Bakers began work long before sunrise because hundreds of people might depend upon the daily bread produced there. Grain arrived in sacks carried from storage rooms. Water sloshed into mixing bowls. Fires were rebuilt from yesterday's ashes. The smell of yeast and smoke gradually filled the warm air. Tia's feet ached constantly from standing on hard stone floors. Her hands were cracked from flour and heat. Yet the rhythm of nighttime baking had become familiar over many years. She liked the quieter hours before sunrise when the temple felt calmer and cooler. Sometimes she listened to distant river sounds while kneading dough beneath flickering lamps. Elsewhere, Scribes slept curled beside stacks of records and papyrus scrolls. Ink stains darkened their fingers permanently. During daylight hours they tracked supplies, labor assignments, taxes, grain counts, and deliveries from villages across the region. Their work demanded concentration beneath difficult conditions. Sweat dripped onto writing boards. Flies gathered around ink pots. Long hours bent their backs and strained their eyes. At night they rested lightly, knowing more records awaited them with sunrise. The temple itself seemed almost alive during these hours between darkness and dawn. Warm stone slowly released the heat stored during daytime. Tiny insects gathered around flames. Somewhere water dripped steadily into a basin. Sand brushed softly across outer courtyards whenever wind entered through the gates. A servant passed quietly carrying fresh oil. Another followed with folded linen cloths. Their shadows stretched and disappeared across the walls. And still the lamps continued burning. Some stood beside statues covered in gold leaf that glimmered softly in the low light. Others illuminated narrow corridors leading toward sacred chambers rarely entered by ordinary workers. Certain lamps burned near offering tables where bread, beer, fruit, flowers, and incense rested before the gods. The flames themselves were small and fragile. A careless movement could extinguish them instantly. Drafts from open doors made them tremble. Poorly trimmed wicks created thick smoke that blackened ceilings and irritated tired eyes. Maintaining proper light required attention throughout the night. Young servants learned quickly not to waste oil. Temple supplies mattered deeply because shortages could create hardship for entire communities. If floods failed or harvests weakened, every resource became precious. Oil jars were measured carefully. Grain distributions changed. Workers received smaller portions of bread or beer. Anxiety spread quietly through villages whenever food stores seemed uncertain. Even during prosperous years, labor remained exhausting. Fields demanded endless effort beneath the Egyptian sun. Farmers rose before dawn while stars still hung overhead. They carried tools across cool ground before heat arrived. Oxen moved slowly through damp soil. Children gathered dropped grain by hand. Women carried water jars balanced carefully across their shoulders while dust clung to their skin. By afternoon, many workers moved like sleepwalkers through shimmering heat. Then evening finally arrived. People washed dust from their faces beside the river or from shared household jars. Meals of bread, onions, beans, or fish were prepared over small cooking fires. Families gathered on rooftops seeking cooler air. Elderly relatives told quiet stories while children slowly drifted toward sleep beneath the stars. And somewhere nearby, inside the great temples, lamps were lit again one by one. The routine never truly ended. In one distant chamber lined with painted columns, an elderly caretaker carefully cleaned soot from a bronze lamp holder using a rough cloth. His name had likely never been recorded anywhere permanent. No great monument carried his story. Yet he had spent nearly 40 years inside these temple walls performing the same patient duties. He remembered younger days when his body moved more easily through long corridors. He remembered floods that reached unusually high along the riverbanks. He remembered seasons of sickness when temple halls grew strangely quiet because so many workers fell ill. He remembered nights when desert winds blew so fiercely that sand drifted beneath the doors and covered entire courtyards by morning. Now his movements were slower. His knees hurt when standing. His eyesight weakened in dim light. Still he continued trimming wicks, filling lamps, cleaning soot, and guarding quiet halls through the night. The temple depended upon such people more than most histories ever describe. Not kings. Not generals. Not famous priests carved into stone. but ordinary workers whose hands kept daily life moving forward one task at a time. Near midnight, cooler air finally drifted through outer courtyards. Palm branches rustled softly in the darkness. Somewhere beyond the temple walls, a baby cried briefly before falling silent again. A dog barked once toward the riverbank. Inside the sanctuary chambers, the lamps glowed steadily against painted walls where colors still remained vivid even after many years. Deep reds, dusty blues, gold, black, green. The figures of gods and sacred animals seemed almost to move within the shifting light. Hori paused beside one column and listened. He could hear distant footsteps somewhere farther inside the temple. He could hear crackling flames from kitchen ovens being prepared for morning bread. He could hear wind brushing softly against stone towers outside. Mostly he heard silence. It was not empty silence. It carried weight and texture. The kind of silence that settles over places where countless people have lived, worked, prayed, suffered, rested, and slept across many generations. He adjusted the wick of another lamp carefully. The flame steadied. And the long ancient night continued slowly onward beside the quiet Nile River. The deepest hours of the night were often the quietest inside the temple. Long after most workers had fallen asleep, long after the ovens cooled and the last voices faded from the courtyards, the stone halls remained awake in their own slow way. Lamps continued to breathe gently in the darkness. Oil flickered softly inside clay bowls. Smoke curled upward in thin gray lines that disappeared near the painted ceilings far above. Outside, the Nile carried moonlight across its moving surface like broken silver. The river never truly rested. Even at night, boats drifted silently along the current. Some carried grain sealed inside baskets and jars. Others carried stone, reeds, linen, or bundles of firewood gathered from distant groves. A few carried sleeping travelers wrapped in rough blankets beneath small woven shelters. Along the riverbanks, fishermen worked by torchlight in shallow water. Their nets moved slowly through the reeds while frogs croaked nearby. Bare feet pressed into cool mud. Mosquitoes drifted above the water in soft clouds. The men spoke quietly to one another because loud voices seemed strange beneath the sleeping sky. One fisherman named Mena sat at the edge of a narrow wooden boat rubbing his tired shoulders while waiting for a net to settle beneath the water. His hands were rough from years spent pulling wet ropes beneath the sun. Salt dried across his skin after long days on the river. He rarely visited the great temples except during festivals or religious holidays, yet the temple lamps were familiar to him. On clear nights he could see their distant glow rising above the dark city like patient stars fixed to the earth. To many ordinary people, the temples felt permanent. The river changed. Floods rose and fell. Crops succeeded or failed. Families grew older. Children became adults. Workers disappeared from one season to the next through sickness, exhaustion, or accident. But the temples remained standing above everything, their stone walls holding steady beneath the desert sky. Even during hard years, the lamps continued burning. Inside one small chamber near the eastern side of the temple complex, a young servant rested briefly against a wall while holding a nearly empty oil jar. His eyelids grew heavy. He had already crossed the temple courtyards many times that night, carrying supplies between storerooms and shrines. Sweat still clung faintly to his neck despite the cooler air. Nearby, another servant carefully scraped hardened soot from the edge of a bronze lamp tray. The work required patience because too much pressure could damage the metal. Tiny black flakes gathered slowly onto the stone floor beneath his hands. Neither spoke much. Most nighttime workers saved their energy. The heat of the Egyptian day drained people deeply, even hours after sunset. Muscles remain sore from lifting, carrying, grinding, kneeling, climbing, or rowing. Many workers learn to move carefully at night, conserving strength for the next sunrise that always arrived too soon. In the temple kitchens, fresh bread dough rested beneath linen cloths while fires slowly strengthened inside clay ovens. Bakers prepared for the long morning ahead. Some sat briefly on overturned baskets sipping watered beer while waiting for the ovens to heat evenly. Others shaped loaves by hand upon smooth wooden boards dusted with flour. The smell inside the kitchens was warm and heavy. Yeast, smoke, ash, ground grain, oil. The scent clung to clothing and hair long after workers left the ovens behind. An older baker named Jida rubbed flour from his forearms while watching the firelight dance across the walls. His back hurt constantly now. Years of bending beside hot ovens had left his spine stiff and painful, especially during colder mornings before sunrise. Still, he trusted the familiar rhythm of the work. Hands shaped dough almost without thought after enough years. Outside the kitchens, temple cats wandered quietly through storage rooms searching for mice among the grain jars. Their eyes reflected the lamp glow brightly whenever they crossed dark corridors. Some workers welcomed them because they protected food supplies. Others chased them away from sacred areas where offerings rested overnight. Near one shrine, a small lamp suddenly sputtered low. The wick had burned unevenly. An elderly caretaker noticed immediately. He crossed the chamber slowly with a fresh strip of linen twisted carefully for replacement. His sandals whispered against the stone floor as he knelt beside the failing flame. The process was simple. Trim the blackened wick. Add oil carefully. Relight the itch. Wait for the flame to steady. Yet even such a small task carried importance inside the temple. Light symbolized order against darkness. Daily rituals depended upon these quiet acts of maintenance repeated endlessly across generations. Workers may have performed them with tired hands and aching backs, but the routines themselves remained steady and ancient. Far beyond the temple walls, the sleeping city stretched beside the river under pale moonlight. Mud brick homes crowded close together along winding roads packed hard by countless feet. Roofs held sleeping families stretched beneath blankets woven from linen or reeds. Some homes sheltered large groups of relatives sharing narrow rooms. Others belonged to widows, fishermen, laborers, or elderly craftsmen living alone beside tiny courtyards filled with storage jars and drying nets. Inside one small house, a mother woke quietly before dawn to grind grain using a heavy stone mill. The slow scraping sound blended softly with distant insects outside. Her youngest child still slept nearby with one arm draped across a rolled blanket. The room smelled faintly of dust, smoke, and baked bread from the evening meal. Grinding grain was exhausting work. The woman pushed the upper stone steadily back and forth while coarse flour collected beneath it little by little. Her shoulders burned from repetition. Tiny particles filled the air around her hands. By sunrise she would already be tired, yet much of the day's labor would still remain ahead. Ancient Egyptian life demanded constant physical effort from nearly everyone. Water had to be carried. Grain had to be ground. Clothing had to be washed by hand beside the river. Mud bricks had to be shaped beneath the sun. Fishing nets required endless repair. Fields demanded planting, weeding, irrigation, and harvest. Even children worked from young ages, gathering reeds, feeding animals, carrying baskets, or helping prepare meals. Rest existed mostly in small moments. A pause beside cool river water. A few breaths beneath shade. A quiet rooftop after sunset. A gentle night breeze drifting through an open doorway. and for some workers inside the temple, moments beside the lamps became strangely peaceful despite the long hours. Hori often felt this during the final stretch before dawn. By then the temple grew especially still. Most priests slept. Kitchen noise softened. Even guards standing at the gates leaned heavily against their spears while fighting exhaustion. Only the lamps remained fully awake. Hori walked now through a narrow passage lined with painted scenes showing boats crossing the Nile. Though he had passed these walls hundreds of times, he still studied the faded figures whenever he carried fresh oil. Fishermen pulling nets. Farmers harvesting grain. Birds rising from marsh grasses. Priests offering incense beside sacred fires. The walls showed ordinary life as much as sacred ritual. Perhaps that was why the temple never felt completely separate from the world outside. The same river flowed through both. The same grain fed workers and priests alike. The same heat pressed down upon everyone beneath the Egyptian sun. At the far end of the passage stood a small open courtyard where cool air drifted downward from the night sky. Hori stopped there briefly. Above him, stars stretched endlessly across the darkness. The desert beyond the city remained silent beneath the moonlight. Sandhills rested pale and motionless far from the green life gathered beside the Nile. Occasionally desert winds carried dry dust toward the city, coating roads, rooftops, and temple steps in fine layers by morning. Hori listened to the wind moving softly between the columns. He wondered sometimes how many nights these temples had already stood here before he was born. Hundreds of years. Perhaps more. Entire generations had lived and disappeared while the same routines continued beneath these stone roofs. Lamps lit. Floors swept. Bread baked. Prayers whispered. Oil carried through the darkness. The thought made him feel strangely small and strangely comforted at the same time. From another courtyard came the slow sound of sandals approaching. An older priest emerged carrying folded linen garments draped across both arms. His face looked tired beneath the lamp glow. He nodded quietly to Hori before continuing toward an inner chamber where morning rituals would soon begin. Even before sunrise, preparations were already underway. Temples followed careful schedules shaped by both practical work and sacred ceremony. Certain offerings needed arranging before dawn. Sacred spaces required cleaning. Water basins had to be refreshed. Fresh bread and beer would soon arrive from the kitchens. Lamps burned throughout the process, guiding workers through the dark hours before daylight entered the halls. Farther beyond the temple grounds, life along the river slowly stirred toward morning. Boatmen sleeping beside docks shifted beneath blankets as cooler air brushed across the water. Donkeys tied near storage yards stamped their feet against insects. In distant fields, farmers prepared to wake before first light so they could begin labor before the full heat arrived. The Egyptian day often became unbearable by midday. Sunlight reflected fiercely from stone walls and dry ground. Air shimmered above roads. Sweat soaked linen clothing within minutes. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads for protection while carrying baskets, tools, or jars beneath the endless brightness. Many laborers developed deep lines across their faces long before old age. Skin darkened and roughened beneath years of sun exposure. Feet toughened from walking hot earth and stone. Hands cracked from constant work with rope, reeds, tools, or clay. Nighttime brought relief. Not complete relief. The air often remained warm far into darkness. But the softer hours after sunset allowed bodies to loosen slightly. People spoke more quietly. Meals stretched longer. Families rested together beneath open skies whenever possible. Even the animals seemed calmer once the harsh sunlight disappeared. Inside the temple gardens, palm leaves stir gently above narrow irrigation channels. The garden supplied herbs, flowers, fruits, and sacred plants used throughout temple life. Garden workers rose early each day to water fragile growth before heat overwhelmed the soil. One gardener slept now beneath a woven shelter near the edge of the courtyard. His empty water jars rested beside him. Earlier he had spent hours carrying water bucket by bucket from nearby canals while dragonflies hovered above the surface. Mud clung thickly to his calves. His shoulders still ached from lifting. The temple depended upon workers like him just as much as it depended upon priests. Without gardeners there would be no flowers for offerings. Without fishermen no fish for temple kitchens. Without farmers no grain for bread. Without potters no jars for oil storage. Without laborers no walls, columns, or repaired roofs. Ancient life moved through countless connected hands. Near one outer gate, 2 guards sat quietly beside a low burning lamp. Their spears rested against the stone wall while they shared pieces of coarse bread left from the evening meal. One man rubbed his knees slowly, complaining in a tired voice about pain from standing long hours. The other listened while staring toward the river. In the distance, faint torchlight moved along the shoreline where early traders prepared boats for travel before sunrise. Some journeys required beginning while the air remained cool. Merchants transporting grain, linen, pottery, or wood preferred moving during quieter morning hours before strong heat and crowded docks slowed everything. Trade connected the Nile settlements like threads woven through cloth. Boats drifted constantly between villages and cities carrying supplies that sustained daily life. Temple oil itself might travel many miles before finally reaching a lamp inside the sanctuary halls. Workers unloading cargo along the docks often labored through both day and night depending upon river traffic and flood conditions. The docks smelled strongly of wet rope, fish, mud, reeds, sweat, and river water. Wood creaked softly beneath shifting cargo. Men shouted instructions across narrow boats. Children gathered fallen grain near storage buildings hoping to bring extra food home to their families. And nearby, towering above the shoreline, the temple lamp still glowed against the darkness. As the night slowly deepened toward dawn, a strange calm settled over the city. The hottest hours were still far away. Morning noise had not yet begun. This small space between midnight and sunrise belonged to quieter sounds. Water moving gently beside reeds. A distant cough from a rooftop sleeper. Soft footsteps crossing temple floors. The faint crackling of oil flames. Hori entered another chamber carrying a fresh jar beneath his arm. This room held rows of carved stone statues partially hidden in darkness. Their faces emerged and disappeared whenever the lamps flickered. Shadows stretched long between the pillars. He moved carefully here because spilled oil stained the floors and angered the caretakers. At the center of the room stood a larger bronze lamp with several burning wicks arranged in a circle. Its light reflected warmly against nearby gold decoration. Hori knelt beside it and added oil slowly from the jar. The smell rose immediately. Earthy. Heavy. Warm. Familiar. He watched the flames strengthen again. Sometimes during these quiet tasks, his mind drifted toward memories of childhood along the riverbanks. He remembered helping his mother gather reeds near shallow water while ibis birds walked slowly through the mud nearby. He remembered afternoons spent chasing goats away from vegetable gardens. He remembered falling asleep beside his brothers on the rooftop while summer winds moved gently through the darkness. Now temple life shaped nearly all his days. Yet the rhythms felt connected somehow. The same moonlight touched both the temple and the river villages. The same wind crossed fields, rooftops, workshops, and sanctuaries alike. The same exhaustion settled into workers everywhere once night arrived. Far overhead, the stars slowly began fading from the eastern horizon. Not sunrise yet, but the first quiet signs that darkness would eventually loosen its hold over the city. Inside the kitchens, bakers rose fully to their work again. Ovens glowed hotter. Fresh loaves entered the heat. Smoke thickened near the ceiling beams. Workers moved more quickly now because morning distributions would begin soon. In storage rooms, servants counted jars and baskets by lamplight. In sleeping quarters, priests stirred awake beneath linen coverings. In nearby homes, women prepared water and grain before children opened sleepy eyes. The ancient city inhaled slowly before another long day beneath the sun. And still, through every hallway and sanctuary inside the temple, the oil lamps continued burning softly beside the quiet Nile River. Before the sun appeared above the eastern horizon, the city already carried the feeling of approaching labor. The darkness softened little by little into deep blue. Shapes emerged slowly from shadow. Palm trees became visible again beside the riverbanks. Rooftops gathered pale moonlight across their flat surfaces where families still slept beneath thin blankets. Inside the temple, the first morning footsteps echoed through the halls. A servant crossed an outer courtyard carrying 2 heavy water jars balanced against his shoulders with a wooden pole. The water moved softly inside the containers with each careful step. He had already walked to the river and back before most people opened their eyes for the day. Cool morning air clung briefly to his damp skin, though he knew the relief would not last long once the sun rose higher. Near the temple kitchens, smoke drifted upward from ovens glowing orange in the dim light. Bakers moved steadily through the warm rooms shaping bread while sweat already formed across their necks and foreheads. Clay bowls scraped against stone counters. Dough pressed beneath tired hands. The scent of fresh baking spread slowly through nearby corridors. Tia stood beside one of the ovens brushing ash from her arms. Her eyes felt heavy from the long night, but there was comfort in the routine. Every morning followed familiar rhythms. The fires needed tending. The loaves needed turning. Grain deliveries needed checking before scribes recorded the amounts on papyrus sheets. Outside, donkeys began braying somewhere beyond the temple walls. The city was waking. Along the Nile shoreline, fishermen returned with their catches before daylight fully arrived. Nets heavy with fish dripped river water onto the wooden docks. Men hauled baskets ashore while gulls circled overhead waiting for scraps. Some fish would travel immediately to market stalls. Others would go toward temple kitchens, noble households, or preservation rooms where workers salted and dried food beneath the heat of the coming day. The dock slowly filled with noise. Wood creaking. Ropes tightening. Quiet conversations. Water striking boat hulls. Sandals against wet boards. Yet even as the city stirred awake, the temple interior remained strangely calm. Thick stone walls softened outside sounds. Inner halls still belonged mostly to shadows and lamp glow. Priests moved through the sanctuaries in measured silence while servants refreshed offerings beside carved statues and painted shrines. Hori carried another tray of oil lamps through a side corridor leading toward the eastern chambers. He had not slept at all. Sometimes younger servants rested briefly after sunrise once the most important work finished, but on busy days they simply continued moving from one task to another until exhaustion settled into every part of the body. His feet hurt badly this morning. The stone floors remained cool now, though by afternoon they would hold the heat of the sun like burning ground. He adjusted the weight of the tray carefully and continued walking beneath walls painted with fading scenes of river life. In one image, farmers harvested grain beneath tall reeds. In another, women carried baskets balanced upon their heads. Elsewhere, fishermen paddled narrow boats through marsh grasses while birds rose into the sky above them. The painted figures seemed peaceful, but Hori knew the real work behind those scenes was difficult beyond words. He had seen laborers collapse beside fields during the hottest months. He had watched workers limp home with swollen knees and cracked hands after long days hauling stone or digging irrigation channels. Ancient Egypt survived because ordinary people endured exhausting labor every single day. When the Nile flooded properly, there was food enough for most families. When the flood waters weakened, fear spread quietly through the villages. Farmers studied the river constantly. Priests observed water levels beside carved stone markers. Merchants worried over grain prices. Mothers counted stored food more carefully inside their homes. Every household understood how closely life depended upon the moods of the river. This year the flood had been decent. Not extraordinary. But enough. Enough grain for bread. Enough reeds for baskets and roofs. Enough crops for temple storage rooms. Enough oil for the lamps. And so the routines continued. Inside a small chamber beside the inner sanctuary, an elderly priest prepared incense using dried herbs and resin ground together in a shallow bowl. His fingers moved slowly with age. The room smelled rich and smoky even before the incense touched flame. Nearby, another servant polished bronze tools with linen cloth while blinking sleep from his eyes. Dawn light had begun reaching some outer courtyards now, though the deeper temple halls still belonged to darkness and oil lamps. One by one, the flames became less visible as natural light slowly entered the temple. This transition happened gently every morning. At first the lamp seemed strong against the darkness. Then pale blue daylight touched the highest columns. Then shadows softened across the floors. Then warm sunlight reached the outer walls. And finally the lamps looked small and weak beside the brightness of day. Yet workers still maintained them carefully. Some would continue burning inside windowless chambers throughout daylight hours where sunlight never entered at all. The temple was enormous enough to contain its own world of darkness. In one remote storeroom, rows of oil jars rested silently beside sacks of grain and baskets of dried onions. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning light entering from high wall openings. The caretaker on duty stretched stiff muscles while recording inventory marks upon a broken pottery shard used for temporary notes. His name was Painasi. Most days he remained inside these cool storage chambers from sunrise until evening, counting supplies and guarding against theft. It was lonely work. He often listened to distant temple sounds echoing faintly through the corridors while rats rustled somewhere behind the baskets. Still, he preferred the storerooms to the river docks where he once labored unloading cargo beneath brutal afternoon heat. At least here the stone walls offered some protection from the sun. Outside, daylight strengthened quickly. Golden light spread across mud brick homes beside the river. Families climbed down from rooftops where they had slept through the cooler night hours. Children rubbed their eyes while mothers prepared simple morning meals of bread and beer. Goats wandered narrow alleyways searching for scraps near cooking fires. Merchants opened storage shutters and carried goods toward busy market roads. The city smelled different in the early morning. Fresh bread. River mud. Smoke. Animal dung. Dust. Wet reeds. Cooking onions. Warm stone. These scents mixed together beneath the growing heat of sunrise. Along one crowded street, laborers gathered carrying tools across their shoulders as they prepared for another day of construction near the western temples. Their linen garments already clung to their backs with sweat though the day had barely begun. Some chewed pieces of coarse bread while walking. Others spoke quietly about wages, sore muscles, or relatives sick at home. One younger worker limped badly from a foot injury wrapped in rough cloth. Yet he still came to work because missing even a few days could mean less food for his family. Many ancient workers lived close to exhaustion. Food existed, but rarely in abundance for ordinary people. Bread filled stomachs, though often heavily mixed with gritty particles from grinding stones. Beer provided nourishment and safer drinking than stagnant water in some seasons. Fish, beans, onions, dates, and figs appeared when available. Meat was less common except during festivals or special occasions. Most people worked hard simply to continue living. And still, life moved with quiet beauty through the hardships. Children laughed while chasing birds beside irrigation canals. Women sang softly while washing linen near the river. Old men rested beneath palm shade telling stories from memory. Cool winds sometimes crossed the Nile at sunset carrying relief after terrible heat. And each evening, lamps glowed again inside the temples. Near the temple entrance, a line of villagers now approached carrying offerings for the morning rituals. Some held baskets of grain. Others brought flowers, fish, woven cloth, or small jars of oil. Their clothing showed signs of labor and travel. Dust-covered sandals and hems. Faces already shone with sweat beneath the strengthening sun. A temple scribe sat nearby recording certain deliveries carefully onto papyrus. His writing brush moved with practiced precision despite the flies gathering around his workspace. Ink stains darkened his fingertips permanently. Years spent bending over records had curved his shoulders forward slightly. The scribe rarely entered the deep sanctuaries where priests performed sacred rites. His world revolved more around numbers, supplies, and measurements. Still, he understood the importance of the lamps because oil inventories passed through his records constantly. How many jars remained? How much oil each shrine consumed? Which deliveries arrived late? Which fields produced better harvests this season? Nothing inside the temple escaped counting for long. Even so, life often slipped beyond the neat lines of written records. No papyrus could fully describe the weariness of laborers beneath summer heat. No careful inventory captured the smell of bread ovens before dawn. No official record preserved the sound of sandals crossing quiet temple floors at midnight. Much of ancient life existed only in moments lived and forgotten. In one shaded courtyard, Hori finally paused beside a stone basin to wash dust from his face. The water felt cool against tired skin. Nearby, pigeons gathered along roof edges while sunlight spread across the upper columns. He watched older servants moving through the courtyards carrying linens, incense, baskets, and fresh flowers. Their routine seemed endless. One task flowed directly into another without pause. Morning offerings became midday cleaning. Midday work became evening preparation. Evening faded into nighttime lamp tending once again. Sometimes Hori wondered if the temple itself ever slept. Perhaps only briefly during the hottest hours of afternoon when movement slowed beneath crushing heat. Even then, some workers remained awake inside kitchens, storerooms, workshops, or shaded chambers. The great stone complex consumed labor constantly. Repairs never ended. Supplies always needed carrying. Lamps always required oil. By late morning the heat had already begun pressing heavily upon the city. Sunlight reflected fiercely from pale walls and dusty roads. Market sellers wrapped cloth around their heads while flies gathered around baskets of fish and dates. Dogs searched for shade beneath carts and stairways. Workers on construction sites wiped sweat constantly from their eyes. Stonemasons struck limestone blocks rhythmically while chips scattered across the ground. Others dragged heavy materials using ropes that burned against their palms. Overseers shouted instructions through the heat while scribes tracked daily labor assignments nearby. Water carriers moved among them, offering brief relief from large clay jars. Many workers drank deeply, then returned immediately to the exhausting rhythm of hauling, lifting, cutting, and shaping stone beneath the blazing sun. Farther away near the fields, farmers bent over irrigation channels, clearing mud and debris so river water could continue reaching the crops. Their feet sank into wet soil. Insects hovered thickly above the canals. Birds circled overhead, searching for movement among the reeds. The work never truly became easier. People simply grew accustomed to carrying exhaustion inside their bodies. At midday, some laborers rested briefly beneath rough shelters made from reeds or cloth stretched across wooden poles. Bread was shared. Beer passed slowly between tired hands. Conversation remained quiet because heat stole energy from speech itself. Meanwhile, inside the temple, cooler shadows still lingered beneath massive stone ceilings. The lamps burned softly in the deeper rooms where sunlight could not reach. An elderly caretaker trimmed several wicks carefully while humming under his breath. He had performed this same task for so many years that his hands moved almost automatically now. Small scissors clipped away burned fibers. Fresh oil filled the shallow bowls. Flames steadied again, one after another. Around him, silence gathered gently. The kind of silence found only in places where routines have repeated across centuries. He could hear distant footsteps somewhere beyond the halls. He could hear pigeons fluttering above the courtyards. He could hear faint market noise carried through outer gates by the wind. Mostly, though, he heard the soft breathing sound of flame itself. Tiny movements of fire consuming oil little by little. He often thought the lamps resembled human lives in certain ways. Fragile. Temporary. Dependent upon constant care. Yet capable of bringing warmth and comfort into dark spaces. By afternoon, sunlight blazed white across the temple courtyards. Stone columns radiated heat strong enough to warm the air around them. Workers moved more slowly now. Even priests shortened conversations and sought shade whenever possible. Some servants slept briefly against cool interior walls during moments between duties. Others soaked cloth in water and draped it across their necks. The entire city seemed to breathe more heavily beneath the crushing heat. Then, slowly, eventually, the long afternoon would begin fading again. Shadows would lengthen across the roads. Birdsong would soften. Cooler winds would return from the river. Families would gather on rooftops once more. And inside the ancient temples beside the Nile, servants would prepare again for another long night of lighting oil lamps beneath the quiet stone ceilings. As the afternoon slowly loosened its hold upon the city, the light across the Nile began to soften into warmer colors. The harsh white brightness that had covered the stone walls all day gradually turned golden. Shadows stretched longer across the roads and courtyards. Workers lifted tired heads toward the western sky, sensing the approach of evening even before the heat fully faded. For many people, this was the hardest part of the day. Their bodies were already worn down from hours of labor, yet there was still work remaining before rest could finally arrive. Farmers continued carrying water through irrigation ditches. Bakers prepared evening loaves. Market sellers packed unsold goods into baskets and jars. Stone workers dragged final loads beneath aching shoulders while overseers counted tools and recorded the day's labor. Dust hung thickly in the warm air. Sandals scraped slowly over dry roads. Children carried bundles of reeds almost as large as themselves. Donkeys groaned beneath heavy cargo tied with rope. And above it all, the temple stood quiet and steady against the deepening sky. Inside the temple complex, shadows gathered once more beneath the massive columns. The stone floors that had burned with heat during midday now slowly cooled. Workers moved through familiar evening routines with tired patience. Some swept sand from the courtyards where desert winds had left pale drifts along the edges of the walls. Others collected empty offering trays from the shrines and carried them toward kitchens or storage rooms. The smell of incense still lingered faintly in many chambers. So did the scent of warm oil. The lamps would soon become important again. Hori sat briefly beside a low wall in one shaded courtyard, resting his arms across his knees. Nearby, a gardener poured water carefully around the roots of young palm trees while birds fluttered among the branches overhead. The air still felt hot, but not unbearable now. A soft river breeze had begun moving through the open spaces between the temple buildings. He closed his eyes for only a moment. Even short pauses felt precious after long days. Across the courtyard, older servants prepared fresh wicks for the coming night. Thin strips of linen rested beside shallow bowls of oil. One man rolled the cloth carefully between his fingers while another cleaned soot from blackened lamp edges using rough cloths dampened with water. Nothing about the work appeared grand. Yet every movement carried the calm repetition of habit learned over many years. One servant tested the balance of a bronze lampstand. Another checked oil levels inside storage jars. Another swept fallen flower petals from the floor near a shrine entrance. Small tasks. Endless tasks. The temple depended upon them all. Far beyond the temple walls, evening life slowly spread across the city beside the Nile. Women prepared meals over cooking fires while smoke rose lazily into the warm sky. Fish crackled above clay ovens. Bread baked upon heated stones. Children chased one another through narrow alleyways until mothers called them home before darkness fully arrived. On the rooftops, families spread woven mats where they would later sleep beneath the open sky. During hotter seasons, indoor rooms trapped too much heat through the night. Roofs offered cooler air and space to breathe. People carried blankets, jars of water, baskets, and sleeping children upward using narrow stairways worn smooth by generations of footsteps. An old man named Ka rested upon one rooftop now while rubbing tired hands together slowly. He had once worked hauling stone for temple construction far to the south. Years beneath the sun had bent his back and stiffened his knees. Now he repaired fishing nets when work was available and spent long evenings watching river boats drift through the fading light. He could see the temple towers from here. As darkness approached, he knew the lamps would soon appear again behind the high walls. Their glow had comforted him since childhood. Even during difficult years, the temple lights remained steady through the night. During floods. During sickness. During seasons when grain stores grew low. The lamps continued burning. Nearby, his granddaughter sat quietly beside him weaving reeds into a basket while evening birds crossed the sky overhead. The smell of lentils and onions drifted upward from the cooking fire below. The city felt softer at this hour. Less strained. Less harsh. The terrible midday heat finally retreated little by little, allowing people to breathe more deeply again. Along the riverbanks, fishermen prepared for another night upon the water. Nets were checked carefully for tears. Small oil lamps were tied securely to boat edges. Wooden poles knocked softly against the docks while the current moved steadily beside them. One younger fisherman laughed quietly at something his older brother said while pushing their narrow boat into the water. Nearby, another man sat alone repairing damaged rope beneath fading sunlight. His fingers moved slowly through the fibers after years spent repeating the same careful motions. The Nile reflected the changing sky beautifully now. Gold became orange. Orange became deep red. Then purple shadows spread gently across the water. Birds settled into reeds along the marshes while insects rose above the river in soft drifting clouds. And inside the temple, evening preparations fully began. Hori rose from the courtyard wall and lifted a fresh oil jar against his shoulder. The clay felt cool beneath his hands. He followed an older caretaker through narrow corridors where daylight already faded into shadow. The deeper chambers darkened first. Tall stone columns blocked the remaining sunlight. Painted ceilings disappeared overhead. The walls became dim and silent once more. One by one, the lamps returned to life. A wick lowered carefully into oil. A flame touched gently to linen. A small glow opening against the darkness. Then another. And another. The temple changed completely during these moments between daylight and night. By afternoon, the halls felt dusty and practical, filled with movement and labor beneath harsh sunlight. But once the lamps awakened again, the stone spaces seemed calmer and older somehow. Shadows softened along the walls. Gold decorations flickered warmly. Painted gods emerged slowly from darkness as though waking from sleep themselves. The workers spoke more quietly now. Footsteps slowed. Voices echoed gently through the chambers. An elderly priest entered one sanctuary carrying fresh incense inside a carved bowl. Smoke curled upward around him while the nearest lamps flickered against painted scenes upon the walls. He paused before the shrine for several long moments without speaking. Outside the chamber, Hori waited patiently beside the doorway holding extra oil. The silence felt heavy but peaceful. He could hear distant kitchen sounds somewhere farther inside the temple. Clay bowls moving against stone surfaces. Bread being stacked for evening meals. Water poured into jars. Elsewhere, servants prepared sleeping areas for workers who remained inside the temple overnight. Thin blankets were spread across floors or rooftops depending upon the weather. Some workers preferred sleeping outdoors where cooler winds crossed the courtyards after midnight. Others chose interior rooms sheltered from insects and drifting sand. The temple at night became almost like a small village. People resting beside walls. Quiet conversations before sleep. Shared meals eaten slowly after long labor. Someone humming softly while cleaning tools. Someone rubbing sore feet beside a fading lamp. The sacred spaces remained important, but ordinary human life surrounded them constantly. Near the kitchens, Tia finally sat down upon a low stool with a small bowl of lentils and bread resting in her lap. Her arms ached from the day's baking. Fine flour still covered parts of her clothing despite repeated washing. Across from her, another kitchen worker dipped bread into oil while staring tiredly at the floor. Neither spoke for a while. They simply ate in silence while warm evening air drifted through the doorway. Nearby, a child slept curled beside stacked grain sacks, too exhausted to finish the evening meal. The steady rhythm of kitchen work had surrounded him since birth. He slept through clattering bowls, crackling ovens, and murmuring conversations without difficulty. Outside, darkness slowly spread across the city. Market noise faded. Cooking fires dimmed. Families settled onto rooftops beneath the stars. The Nile turned black beneath the moonlight except where lamps reflected softly upon its surface. And throughout the temple, the oil flames continued glowing quietly in the halls. Some lamps burned inside tiny wall niches carved long ago into the stone. Others rested upon tall bronze stands shaped like flowers or birds. Simpler clay lamps sat directly upon the floor beside doorways and shrines. Each required attention through the night. Oil had to be replenished. Wicks trimmed. Smoke cleaned away. A neglected lamp could fail quickly. An old caretaker named Nebamun inspected several sanctuary lamps now while carrying a small linen pouch of fresh wicks tied at his waist. His eyesight weakened more every year, forcing him to lean close to each flame while working. The skin upon his hands had become thin and marked with age spots, yet his movements remained careful and practiced. He remembered serving inside these halls as a young boy no older than Hori. At that time the temple had seemed impossibly large. The columns enormous. The statues frightening. The silence overwhelming. Now the corridors felt as familiar to him as the rooms of his own childhood home once had. He knew every uneven stone. Every hidden draft of cool air. Every lamp that burned too quickly. Every floor tile worn smooth by countless sandals. Time moved strangely inside temples. Generations passed outside while the routines within changed very little. Nebamun sometimes wondered how many thousands of nights these same tasks had already continued before his own birth. Other caretakers long forgotten must have carried oil through these same corridors beneath older kings and older moons. Perhaps one day Hori would grow old performing the same work. Lighting lamps. Cleaning soot. Walking silent halls while the Nile flowed nearby through another century. The thought did not seem sad to him. Only peaceful. Near midnight, cooler winds finally entered the temple courtyards. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. Workers sleeping outdoors adjusted blankets around their shoulders while insects hummed gently beyond the walls. Hori crossed an open courtyard carrying an empty oil jar back toward the storerooms. Above him, the stars stretched brilliantly across the dark sky. The desert beyond the river lay silent and invisible beneath the night. He paused beside a reflecting pool where moonlight shimmered upon still water. The air smelled faintly of whetstone and lotus flowers. For a long moment, he simply listened. Far away, he could hear fishermen calling quietly to one another upon the river. Closer nearby, a donkey shifted its weight beside a storage building. Somewhere deeper inside the temple, a caretaker adjusted another lamp. Small sounds. Gentle sounds. The sounds of ordinary life continuing through the ancient night. Hori dipped his fingers briefly into the cool pool water and rubbed dust from his wrists. His body felt heavy with exhaustion now. Yet the night still stretched ahead before rest would come. Soon more lamps would require attention. More corridors would need walking. More oil would need carrying through the darkness. And so, beneath the endless stars beside the quiet Nile River, the temple breathed softly onward through another peaceful ancient night. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley. Above the sleeping city, the stars remained clear and endless, untouched by smoke or bright light. The desert sky felt enormous during these hours after midnight, stretching silently above the river, the temples, the fields, and the countless mud brick homes gathered close to the water's edge. Cool air drifted gently through narrow streets where most fires had already faded into ash. From high rooftops came the quiet sound of sleeping families breathing beneath thin linen blankets. A child turned softly in sleep. An old woman coughed once beneath the stars. Somewhere nearby, clay jars shifted faintly as the night breeze touched them. The city rested as best it could before another long day of labor. Yet inside the temples, wakefulness continued. The oil lamps still burned beside painted walls and towering columns. Their small flames moved gently whenever cooler air entered the halls. Long shadows stretched across carved floors where generations of sandals had worn the stone smooth and shallow. Hori moved quietly through one of the inner corridors carrying a shallow bronze tray filled with fresh wicks, linen cloths, and small clay oil cups. His eyes felt dry with exhaustion now. The hours after midnight were always the hardest. The body longed for sleep, but the work remained steady and careful. He passed beneath towering statues whose faces disappeared high into darkness above him. During daylight the statues seemed solid and still, but at night the shifting lamp glow made them appear almost alive. Their shadows moved slowly across the walls whenever flames trembled. At first this frightened him. Now it mostly made him feel calm. The temple at night no longer felt empty to him. It felt full of quiet presence. Full of memory. Full of slow breathing silence held inside ancient stone. Near the sanctuary entrance, Nebamun knelt beside a bronze lampstand polishing soot from its base with a rough cloth. A small bowl of oil rested beside him. He glanced up briefly as Hori approached. "You walk more softly now," the old caretaker murmured in a low tired voice. Hori smiled faintly but said nothing. Nebamun returned to his work. His hands moved slowly but steadily despite his age. Every motion seemed measured by long habit. He no longer wasted movement. Years of labor had taught his body to preserve strength wherever possible. The older workers often moved like this. Quietly. Carefully. Without hurry. Ancient life rewarded patience more than speed. A careless worker spilled oil. Dropped tools. Ruined bread. Cracked pottery. Damaged linen. Mistakes created more labor for everyone. And labor already filled every hour of the day. From somewhere deeper inside the temple came the faint smell of incense drifting through the corridors. Hori followed it into a smaller chamber where several lamps glowed around a low offering table covered with bread, figs, flowers, and tiny bowls of beer left for the gods. The flowers were already beginning to wilt slightly in the warmth. He carefully added oil to the nearest lamp. The flame brightened again. Small tasks. Always small tasks. Yet together they carried the enormous temple gently through the night. Outside the temple walls, the Nile moved slowly through darkness beneath the moon. Along the riverbanks, fishermen checked nets by lamplight while insects drifted above the reeds. Some men spoke softly from boat to boat while others worked alone in silence. Mena sat cross-legged inside his narrow fishing boat untangling part of a damaged net beneath a small hanging lamp. His fingers worked carefully through the fibers while the current rocked the boat gently beneath him. Nearby, his younger brother slept curled beside baskets half filled with fish caught earlier in the night. The river smelled rich and alive. Wet reeds. Mud. Fish. Cool water. The scent changed constantly with the seasons, the floods, and the weather. Mena had spent nearly his entire life upon these waters. He knew the quiet channels between the reeds. He knew where fish gathered during different flood levels. He knew how moonlight changed the surface of the river and how winds from the desert could shift unexpectedly after midnight. He also knew exhaustion well. Fishing demanded endless patience and physical strength. Nets grew heavy with water. Boats required repair. Long hours passed beneath sun and insects. Storms could arrive suddenly during flood season. Yet the river fed families generation after generation, and so the fishermen continued returning night after night. Farther along the shoreline, several women washed clothing beside shallow water beneath the moonlight. During daytime the riverbanks often became crowded and unbearably hot. Some workers preferred the cooler nighttime hours when possible, even though fatigue weighed heavily upon them. One woman beat wet linen gently against smooth stones while speaking quietly to her sister beside her. Their hands were cracked from labor and river water. Nearby, children slept wrapped in blankets beside baskets of laundry waiting to dry by morning. The work never truly ended. Even nighttime carried responsibilities. Back inside the temple, Hori climbed a narrow staircase leading toward the upper roof areas where several lamps burned beside small shrines open to the night air. The stone steps were uneven from age. Dust gathered thickly in the corners where wind carried sand upward from the courtyards below. As he reached the roof, cooler air touched his face immediately. The relief felt wonderful. He paused for a moment beside the parapet wall overlooking the city. Below him, the Nile reflected moonlight in long silver lines. Clusters of homes stretched quietly along the riverbanks while distant dogs barked somewhere beyond the sleeping streets. Here and there tiny household lamps still glowed through open windows or rooftop shelters. Most people were asleep now. Laborers resting aching backs. Farmers recovering from long days in flooded fields. Bakers sleeping beside cooling ovens. Children curled beside parents beneath the stars. Only a few remained awake. Guards. Fishermen. Temple workers. Mothers tending sick children. Travelers arriving late along the river. The city belonged to them during these silent hours before dawn. Hori crossed the rooftop carefully toward a small stone shrine where two lamps flickered weakly beside carved offerings. Wind moved more strongly up here, causing the flames to bend and dance. He knelt beside them and adjusted the wicks. Behind him, the desert stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight. No trees. No river. Only pale sand disappearing into darkness. The contrast always felt strange to him. Life gathered so tightly beside the Nile while beyond it the desert waited silent and empty beneath the stars. Everything depended upon the river. Without it, the fields would die. The gardens would dry. The oil crops would fail. The bread ovens would go cold. Even the temple lamps would eventually darken. He poured fresh oil slowly. The flames steadied again. Then he remained there for a while listening to the wind move across the rooftop stones. Below, the temple courtyards lay mostly quiet now. A few workers slept near the walls wrapped in linen blankets. One guard sat awake beside an outer gate rubbing his eyes while leaning against a spear. Near the kitchens, faint orange light still glowed from banked oven fires prepared for morning bread. The temple looked peaceful from above. Like a sleeping stone island floating within the dark city. Yet Hori knew how much labor filled every corner of it each day. Sweeping. Lifting. Washing. Grinding. Writing. Carrying. Repairing. Cooking. Lighting lamps. Ordinary tasks repeated endlessly beneath the weight of the sun. In one lower chamber, Tia had finally fallen asleep beside stacked grain baskets after cleaning the kitchen floors with water and reed brushes. Her hands still smelled faintly of dough and smoke. Nearby, another baker snored softly against a wall while embers glowed red inside the ovens. Even in sleep, the kitchens remained warm. The smell of bread lingered heavily in the air. Rats rustled faintly near storage bins until a temple cat slipped silently through the shadows searching for movement. Its paws made almost no sound upon the stone floor. Elsewhere, scribes slept beside rolled papyrus records stacked carefully inside wooden chests. Ink pots rested nearby covered with cloth to prevent drying. Tomorrow the records would continue again. Oil inventories. Grain counts. Labor assignments. Delivery lists. Temple life generated endless writing. Yet much of real life escaped the records entirely. No scribe wrote about sore feet crossing cold floors before dawn. No inventory list described the sound of wind moving through temple columns at midnight. No official account captured the weariness in workers' eyes after long afternoons beneath the Egyptian sun. History often remembered rulers and monuments while forgetting the countless tired hands that sustained them. Near the temple gardens, a gardener named Pentu woke briefly from sleep and sat upright listening to the night sounds around him. Palm leaves rustled overhead. Water moved softly through irrigation channels nearby. The earth still held warmth from the daytime sun beneath his bare feet. He drank slowly from a clay water jar resting beside his blanket. Tomorrow he would rise before sunrise again to tend the temple plants before heat overwhelmed the gardens. Lotus flowers required careful watering. Young palms needed protection from insects. Herbs used for incense and medicine had to be harvested at proper times. The work demanded patience. Everything in Egypt demanded patience. Crops grew slowly. Stone carved slowly. Bread baked slowly. Boats traveled slowly against the current. And through all of it, the lamps continued burning one careful flame at a time. Hours passed quietly. The stars shifted overhead little by little. The night breeze cooled further. Somewhere far off, a jackal cried across the desert darkness. Inside the temple sanctuary, Nebamun finished cleaning another row of lamps and slowly stood with visible effort. His knees ached sharply tonight. Age settled heavily into his bones during colder hours before dawn. He carried the empty oil bowl carefully toward the storeroom corridors. As he walked, the familiar temple smell surrounded him. Warm stone. Old incense. Smoke. Dust. Oil. Linen. These scents had filled nearly his entire life. Sometimes he wondered whether he would even recognize the world beyond the temple anymore if he left for long enough. The routines here shaped everything. The lamps marked the passage of hours more clearly than the sky itself. Bright at night. Dim at dawn. Unnecessary at noon. Important again by sunset. A slow endless cycle. Ahead of him, Hori emerged from the rooftop stairs carrying the nearly empty oil jar. Their eyes met briefly in the corridor glow. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary in these quiet hours. Together they continued walking deeper into the temple where the lamps still flickered gently against the ancient walls while outside the Nile River flowed silently beneath the fading stars. The final hours before dawn carried a special kind of stillness beside the Nile. The night had grown cooler now. The heat trapped inside the stone walls during the day slowly drifted away into the darkness. Across the rooftops of the sleeping city, blankets pulled closer around tired bodies while soft winds moved gently from the river toward the desert beyond. The stars remained bright overhead, though the eastern horizon had begun changing almost invisibly. Darkness there no longer looked completely black. A faint gray softness rested low above the distant fields. Inside the temple, the lamps still glowed steadily through the quiet halls. Their light reflected faintly against polished stone floors where centuries of footsteps had worn shallow paths through the rock. The columns rose upward like silent tree trunks disappearing into shadow. Painted figures along the walls watched over the sleeping temple workers and weary caretakers moving through the last hours of night. Hori walked slowly now. Exhaustion had settled deeply into his legs and shoulders. Every oil jar felt heavier near dawn. Every staircase seemed longer. His sandals scraped softly against the floor as he crossed another narrow passage carrying fresh wicks tucked beneath one arm. The temple smelled different at this hour. The strong sense of incense and cooking fires had faded somewhat. What remained was softer and older somehow. Cool stone. Lingering smoke. Dust. Oil. Damp linen drying near the kitchens. The faint earthy smell drifting inward from the riverbanks outside. In one chamber, several lamps burned low beside a row of sacred statues. Their flames had shrunk small and uneven. Hori knelt carefully beside them and began trimming the blackened wicks with a tiny bronze blade. The work required steady hands. Too much trimming extinguished the flame entirely. Too little caused smoke and sputtering. He worked slowly, blinking tired eyes while the warm light flickered across his face. Nearby, Nebamun rested briefly against a column with both hands folded over the top of his walking staff. His breathing sounded heavier tonight. Age pressed harder upon him during the colder hours before dawn when joints stiffened and old injuries ached most sharply. For a long moment he simply watched the lamps. Their flames bent gently whenever wind moved through hidden cracks in the stone. Then he spoke quietly. "When I was young," he murmured, "I believed the gods stayed awake because of the lamps." Hori glanced toward him. Nebamun smiled faintly at the thought. "Now I think perhaps the lamps stay awake because of us." The old caretaker's voice carried no sadness. Only tired reflection shaped by many years inside these halls. Hori returned his attention to the wicks. The tiny flames brightened again one after another. Far beyond the temple walls, the riverbanks remained mostly silent. A few fishing boats still drifted across the water beneath the moonlight while fishermen checked their final nets before morning. The current moved slowly around the reeds with soft whispering sounds. Mena sat hunched near the edge of his boat staring toward the eastern horizon. His younger brother still slept beside the baskets of fish, wrapped tightly against the cool wind. The night's work had been decent. Not abundant, but enough. Enough fish for market. Enough to trade for bread, oil, and vegetables. Enough to continue another week. He rubbed his sore hands slowly and listened to the water against the boat hull. Fishermen often measured time differently from temple workers. Their lives followed the moods of the river more than the movement of the sun alone. Flood seasons changed fishing routes completely. Storms could force long delays. Some nights passed in silence with empty nets while others brought heavy catches before midnight. Yet both fishermen and temple caretakers shared the same exhaustion by dawn. Bodies worn down by repetition. Hands hardened through years of labor. Eyes heavy beneath fading stars. Near the shoreline, several women already approached the river carrying empty jars for morning water. Their sandals pressed quietly into damp earth while birds stirred among the reeds nearby. They moved carefully through the darkness, speaking softly so as not to wake sleeping children carried against their shoulders. Soon the city would fully awaken. Bread ovens would roar again. Markets would fill with voices. Animals would crowd the roads. Construction hammers would echo against stone. But not yet. For now, the world remained suspended between sleep and labor. Inside the temple kitchens, embers glowed faintly beneath layers of ash while bakers slowly prepared the morning fires. Tia pushed wood carefully into one oven and watched orange light bloom softly through the darkness. Smoke curled upward toward the ceiling beams where years of soot blackened the stone above. Her arms trembled slightly from fatigue. She had slept only briefly. Most temple workers lived this way during busy periods. Rest arrived in fragments. A short sleep beside the ovens. A quiet moment beneath courtyard shade. An hour stretched upon a rooftop before dawn duties returned. Still, life continued. The ovens warmed. The dough rose. The bread baked. Outside the kitchen entrance, a boy carried sacks of grain from the storerooms while yawning heavily. Flour dust already coated his bare feet and ankles. He stumbled once from exhaustion but steadied himself before the heavy sack slipped. No one scolded him. Every worker understood tiredness. The temple itself seemed to breathe more slowly during these final nighttime hours. Sounds echoed farther through the corridors because so few people moved now. A single cough from a distant chamber carried across the stone halls. Sand brushed softly beneath the outer gates where desert winds drifted inward. And always, somewhere nearby, lamps flicker gently against the darkness. In one small sanctuary near the center of the temple, an elderly priest sat alone beside a low table covered with papyrus scrolls. A single lamp burned beside his elbow while he copied sacred words carefully onto fresh sheets using black ink and a thin reed brush. His eyesight had weakened over the years, forcing him to lean closer to the writing surface. Fine wrinkles crossed his forehead. Ink stained the sides of his fingers permanently dark. He paused often now. Not from distraction. From fatigue. Writing by lamplight demanded patience and concentration, especially during the final hours before dawn when the body longed for sleep. Still, he continued steadily line after line because the temple records and sacred texts required preservation. Outside the chamber, Hori passed quietly with another oil jar balanced against his hip. The old priest looked up briefly. Their eyes met for only a moment before each returned silently to his own task. Ancient life often moved this way. Countless people performing separate duties side by side without many words. The baker kneading dough. The fisherman untangling nets. The farmer repairing irrigation walls. The caretaker trimming wicks. The scribe recording grain counts. Each small task joined together like threads inside a woven cloth. Without one, the others became harder. Without farmers there was no grain. Without grain there was no bread. Without oil crops there were no lamps. Without laborers there were no temples to light at all. The entire world beside the Nile rested upon ordinary human effort repeated endlessly through the generations. Far above the city, the stars had begun fading more noticeably now. The eastern horizon carried pale silver light spreading slowly across the distant desert edge. Birds stirred among the temple palms. A rooster cried somewhere beyond the rooftops. The first true signs of morning had arrived. Workers throughout the temple responded almost instinctively. Movements became slightly quicker. Kitchen fires strengthened. Water jars were refilled. Fresh offerings prepared for sunrise rituals moved toward the sanctuary chambers. Hori entered a long hallway lined with painted columns and noticed how the lamps already looked weaker against the growing natural light. Their glow no longer dominated the darkness as completely as before. Soon daylight would reclaim the halls. But for now the lamps still mattered. He paused beside one particularly old clay lamp resting inside a carved wall niche. Its surface had darkened almost black from years of smoke and handling. Tiny cracks marked the edges where heat and time had slowly worn the clay thinner. How many nights had it burned here? How many caretakers before him had trimmed its wick? How many generations had crossed this corridor carrying oil through the darkness before dawn? The thought filled him with strange calm. Ancient Egypt often felt enormous and endless to those living within it. The river continued flowing. The temples continued standing. The fields continued producing harvests year after year. Human lives appeared small beside such vast repetition. Yet perhaps there was comfort in that smallness too. The lamp did not need to burn forever. Only through one more night. Then another worker would tend it again tomorrow. Outside the temple walls, the city slowly emerged from sleep. Women swept dust from doorways. Children rubbed tired eyes beside cooking fires. Donkeys brayed impatiently near market roads. Boats drifted toward the docks carrying fish, grain, reeds, and travelers beneath the pale early sky. The Nile reflected the first gray light of dawn. Mist hovered faintly above parts of the water where cooler air touched the river surface. And inside the temple, Nebumun carefully extinguished several outer courtyard lamps no longer needed against the growing daylight. One by one the flames disappeared. Tiny threads of smoke rose gently upward. The darkness retreated from the stone walls. Morning had nearly arrived. Hori stood silently beside the old caretaker watching the eastern light spread across the temple courtyard. Birds crossed overhead between the columns while distant market sounds slowly awakened beyond the gates. Another night had passed. Another long ancient night beside the Nile River filled with quiet labor, flickering lamps, tired workers, and soft silence carried through the stone halls. Soon the heat would return again. The dust. The noise. The endless work beneath the sun. But for this brief moment before full sunrise, the world felt calm and cool and almost weightless, as though the ancient city itself still lingered halfway inside a dream. The first sunlight touched the upper temple walls gently. At first it appeared only as pale gold along the highest edges of stone columns and rooftop corners. Then slowly the light spread downward across carvings, painted walls, and quiet courtyards still cool from the night air. The stars disappeared one by one above the Nile until only the soft blue of morning remained. Birds filled the sky now. Small flocks crossed over the riverbanks searching for insects among the reeds and wet soil. Their calls echoed softly between the temple towers while workers moved through the early morning routines below. The city was awake again. Smoke rose from cooking fires across the rooftops. Bread ovens warmed. Doors opened onto dusty streets where merchants already carried baskets toward the markets. Donkeys shuffled beneath loads of grain and reeds while children followed sleepily beside them. The smell of morning spread everywhere. Fresh bread. Wet earth from the riverbanks. Ash. Palm fiber. Fish. Warm milk. The scent drifted through the streets and entered even the outer temple courtyards on the soft breeze. Inside the temple, some lamps still burned within the deeper chambers untouched by sunlight. Hori walked through those dim corridors now carrying a clay bowl filled with used wicks blackened from the night. His body felt heavy and slow after so many sleepless hours. Every sound seemed distant to him. Even the temple itself appeared softer around the edges, as though exhaustion had wrapped the world in haze. Still, the work continued. A servant passed carrying folded linen cloths toward the sanctuary. Another swept fallen sand from the floor with a reed broom. Somewhere farther away, a priest recited morning prayers in a low steady voice. The temple never truly rested. Only its rhythms changed with the movement of the sun. Near the kitchens, Tia stacked fresh loaves into woven baskets while steam rose into the cool morning air. The ovens glowed brightly now, their heat pressing heavily against the walls. Several younger workers prepared beer jars beside the entrance while scribes nearby checked grain counts against storage records. One basket after another left the kitchens for temple workers, priests, guards, and laborers. Bread formed the center of nearly every meal in ancient Egypt. Dark bread. Coarse bread. Flat bread baked quickly against hot surfaces. Loaves flavored with dates or herbs when supplies allowed. The smell filled homes, temples, markets, and boats from dawn until nightfall. Yet making it demanded endless labor. Grain planted beneath the sun. Harvested by hand. Carried in sacks. Ground between stones. Mixed into dough. Baked beside roaring heat. Even a simple morning meal carried the effort of countless tired hands. Outside the temple gates, villagers gathered slowly with baskets of produce and jars balanced carefully against their hips. Some had traveled before dawn from nearby settlements along the river. Dust clung to their sandals and clothing from the roads. A few waited quietly in the shade while guards inspected deliveries headed toward the temple storerooms. Among them stood an older farmer named Beck carrying onions and bundles of leeks tied with reed cord. His face had darkened deeply from years beneath the sun. Fine cracks marked the skin around his eyes and mouth. He shifted the heavy basket slowly from one shoulder to the other while waiting. The harvest season had been difficult this year. Not disastrous, but difficult enough. Some irrigation channels had dried too quickly during the hottest months. Certain fields produced weaker crops. Farmers worried constantly about water levels because even small changes along the Nile could shape entire seasons of survival. Beck thought often about the river. Every farmer did. The floodwaters determined nearly everything. Too little water brought fear. Too much brought destruction. People watched the river carefully as though studying the moods of a living creature older and stronger than themselves. Eventually the guards allowed the deliveries through the gates. Servants carried baskets inward toward the storerooms while scribes recorded quantities beside the entrance. The routine repeated every morning almost without pause. Grain, vegetables, fish, oil, flowers, linen, wood. Everything needed measuring. Everything needed carrying. Ancient temples consumed supplies constantly. And so ordinary people labored endlessly to sustain them. Hori reached the storeroom corridors where the air felt cooler and darker than the sunlit courtyards outside. Rows of jars lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Some contained oil. Others held beer, dried fruit, grain, or salted fish sealed beneath linen covers. Painasi sat nearby marking fresh inventory notes onto a broken pottery shard while muttering softly to himself. He looked tired already despite the early hour. More oil arrived before dawn, he said without looking up. Hori nodded quietly. The temple used astonishing amounts of oil over time. Even the smallest lamps required constant refilling. During major ceremonies or festivals, entire hallways glowed with flame for hours at a time. All that light depended upon harvests far beyond the temple walls. Fields of oil plants swaying beside irrigation canals. Workers crushing seeds beneath heavy stones. Boatmen transporting jars along the river. Laborers unloading cargo beneath the heat. Every lamp carried traces of distant labor within it. From the storerooms, Hori continued toward the inner chambers where several lamps still flickered against the dim walls. Here sunlight rarely reached even at midday. The corridors felt cool beneath his bare feet. He paused beside one sanctuary entrance where Nebamun sat carefully cleaning a bronze lampstand using oil and cloth. Morning light touched only the very edge of the doorway behind him. "You should sleep soon," the old caretaker murmured. Hori smiled faintly. "So should you." Nebamun chuckled softly beneath his breath. "Old men sleep little." The sound faded gently into the quiet chamber. For a moment neither spoke further. They simply listened to the distant life of the temple awakening beyond the walls. Footsteps. Voices. Sweeping reeds. Kitchen sounds. Birds crossing the courtyards overhead. Morning had fully arrived now. Outside, sunlight spread brightly across the Nile River. Fishing boats returned steadily toward the docks carrying the final catches of the night. Market sellers arranged vegetables, fish, pottery, and woven goods beneath rough cloth shelters for shade. Already the heat began returning. Not yet terrible, but noticeable. The cool softness of dawn disappeared quickly in Egypt. By midday, the roads would burn beneath the sun again. Farmers would wipe sweat from their eyes while bending over flooded fields. Stone workers would labor beneath shimmering heat rising from unfinished walls. Children carrying water jars would search desperately for patches of shade. The cycle repeated endlessly. Morning labor. Afternoon exhaustion. Evening relief. Night silence. Then morning again. Along one busy road near the docks, Merchants shouted prices while goats wandered between baskets of dates and onions. Potters displayed fresh clay vessels beside woven mats. Flies gathered around fish laid upon wet cloths to keep them cool. The market carried its own rhythm separate from the temple. Louder. Faster. More crowded. Yet still shaped by the same river and the same labor. Women bargained over grain quantities while balancing children against their hips. Boatmen unloaded bundles of papyrus reeds onto the dusty ground. A man sharpened bronze blades beside a shaded wall while sparks flickered briefly into the sunlight. Everywhere, hands moved. Lifting. Sorting. Cleaning. Counting. Repairing. The ordinary work of survival filled every corner of the ancient city. Back inside the temple, Hori finally reached a small resting chamber near the rear courtyard where several overnight workers slept during daylight hours. Thin mats covered the floor beside the walls. A narrow opening near the ceiling allowed cooler air to drift through. Two servants already slept deeply nearby. One snored softly with an arm across his face. The other still wore flour dust upon his clothing from kitchen work. Hori lowered himself slowly onto an empty mat. His muscles ached from climbing stairs and carrying oil through the long night. The stone floor beneath the woven mat felt surprisingly cool against his tired body. Outside the chamber, temple life continued steadily. Water jars scraped against stone. Sandals crossed the corridors. Someone laughed briefly in a distant courtyard. Somewhere a hammer struck metal with slow measured rhythm. Yet here in the dim room, exhaustion wrapped around him almost instantly. Before sleep fully arrived, he listened quietly to the fading sounds of the temple. The lamps would still be burning somewhere deep within the sanctuary halls. Workers would still be tending kitchens and storerooms. Priests would still be moving through rituals beneath painted ceilings. The great temple breathed onward whether he slept or woke. That thought comforted him strangely. Outside, sunlight climbed higher over the Nile Valley. Heat spread slowly across the fields. Farmers bent over wet soil while birds circled overhead. Fishermen repaired torn nets beside the docks. Children carried baskets through dusty roads. And hidden within the cool stone heart of the temple, small oil lamps continued glowing softly against the ancient walls while tired workers drifted briefly into sleep before another long night would come again. The first sunlight touched the upper temple walls gently. At first it appeared only as pale gold along the highest edges of stone columns and rooftop corners. Then slowly the light spread downward across carvings, painted walls, and quiet courtyards still cool from the night air. The stars disappeared one by one above the Nile until only the soft blue of morning remained. Birds filled the sky now. Small flocks crossed over the riverbanks searching for insects among the reeds and wet soil. Their calls echoed softly between the temple towers while workers moved through the early morning routines below. The city was awake again. Smoke rose from cooking fires across the rooftops. Bread ovens warmed. Doors opened onto dusty streets where merchants already carried baskets toward the markets. Donkeys shuffled beneath loads of grain and reeds while children followed sleepily beside them. The smell of morning spread everywhere. Fresh bread. Wet earth from the riverbanks. Ash. Palm fiber. Fish. Warm milk. The scent drifted through the streets and entered even the outer temple courtyards on the soft breeze. Inside the temple, some lamps still burned within the deeper chambers untouched by sunlight. Hori walked through those dim corridors now carrying a clay bowl filled with used wicks blackened from the night. His body felt heavy and slow after so many sleepless hours. Every sound seemed distant to him. Even the temple itself appeared softer around the edges, as though exhaustion had wrapped the world in haze. Still, the work continued. A servant passed carrying folded linen cloths toward the sanctuary. Another swept fallen sand from the floor with a reed broom. Somewhere farther away, a priest recited morning prayers in a low steady voice. The temple never truly rested. Only its rhythms changed with the movement of the sun. Near the kitchens, Tia stacked fresh loaves into woven baskets while steam rose into the cool morning air. The ovens glowed brightly now, their heat pressing heavily against the walls. Several younger workers prepared beer jars beside the entrance while scribes nearby checked grain counts against storage records. One basket after another left the kitchens for temple workers, priests, guards, and laborers. Bread formed the center of nearly every meal in ancient Egypt. Dark bread, coarse bread, flat bread baked quickly against hot surfaces. Loaves flavored with dates or herbs when supplies allowed. The smell filled homes, temples, markets, and boats from dawn until nightfall. Yet making it demanded endless labor. Grain planted beneath the sun. Harvested by hand. Carried in sacks. Ground between stones. Mixed into dough. Baked beside roaring heat. Even a simple morning meal carried the effort of countless tired hands. Outside the temple gates, villagers gathered slowly with baskets of produce and jars balanced carefully against their hips. Some had traveled before dawn from nearby settlements along the river. Dust clung to their sandals and clothing from the roads. A few waited quietly in the shade while guards inspected deliveries headed toward the temple storerooms. Among them stood an older farmer named Beck carrying onions and bundles of leeks tied with reed cord. His face had darkened deeply from years beneath the sun. Fine cracks marked the skin around his eyes and mouth. He shifted the heavy basket slowly from one shoulder to the other while waiting. The harvest season had been difficult this year. Not disastrous, but difficult enough. Some irrigation channels had dried too quickly during the hottest months. Certain fields produced weaker crops. Farmers worried constantly about water levels because even small changes along the Nile could shape entire seasons of survival. Beck thought often about the river. Every farmer did. The floodwaters determined nearly everything. Too little water brought fear. Too much brought destruction. People watched the river carefully as though studying the moods of a living creature older and stronger than themselves. Eventually the guards allowed the deliveries through the gates. Servants carried baskets inward toward the storerooms while scribes recorded quantities beside the entrance. The routine repeated every morning almost without pause. Grain. Vegetables. Fish. Oil. Flowers. Linen. Wood. Everything needed measuring. Everything needed carrying. Ancient temples consumed supplies constantly. And so ordinary people labored endlessly to sustain them. Hori reached the storeroom corridors where the air felt cooler and darker than the sunlit courtyards outside. Rows of jars lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Some contained oil. Others held beer, dried fruit, grain, or salted fish sealed beneath linen covers. Painasi sat nearby marking fresh inventory notes onto a broken pottery shard while muttering softly to himself. He looked tired already despite the early hour. More oil arrived before dawn, he said without looking up. Hori nodded quietly. The temple used astonishing amounts of oil over time. Even the smallest lamps required constant refilling. During major ceremonies or festivals, entire hallways glowed with flame for hours at a time. All that light depended upon harvests far beyond the temple walls. Fields of oil plants swaying beside irrigation canals. Workers crushing seeds beneath heavy stones. Boatmen transporting jars along the river. Laborers unloading cargo beneath the heat. Every lamp carried traces of distant labor within it. From the storerooms, Hori continued toward the inner chambers where several lamps still flickered against the dim walls. Here sunlight rarely reached even at midday. The corridors felt cool beneath his bare feet. He paused beside one sanctuary entrance where Nebamun sat carefully cleaning a bronze lampstand using oil and cloth. Morning light touched only the very edge of the doorway behind him. "You should sleep soon," the old caretaker murmured. Hori smiled faintly. "So should you." Nebamun chuckled softly beneath his breath. "Old men sleep little." The sound faded gently into the quiet chamber. For a moment neither spoke further. They simply listened to the distant life of the temple awakening beyond the walls. Footsteps. Voices. Sweeping reeds. Kitchen sounds. Birds crossing the courtyards overhead. Morning had fully arrived now. Outside, sunlight spread brightly across the Nile River. Fishing boats returned steadily toward the docks carrying the final catches of the night. Market sellers arranged vegetables, fish, pottery, and woven goods beneath rough cloth shelters for shade. Already the heat began returning. Not yet terrible, but noticeable. The cool softness of dawn disappeared quickly in Egypt. By midday, the roads would burn beneath the sun again. Farmers would wipe sweat from their eyes while bending over flooded fields. Stone workers would labor beneath shimmering heat rising from unfinished walls. Children carrying water jars would search desperately for patches of shade. The cycle repeated endlessly. Morning labor. Afternoon exhaustion. Evening relief. Night silence. Then morning again. Along one busy road near the docks, merchants shouted prices while goats wandered between baskets of dates and onions. Potters displayed fresh clay vessels beside woven mats. Flies gathered around fish laid upon wet cloths to keep them cool. The market carried its own rhythm separate from the temple. Louder. Faster. More crowded. Yet still shaped by the same river and the same labor. Women bargained over grain quantities while balancing children against their hips. Boatmen unloaded bundles of papyrus reeds onto the dusty ground. A man sharpened bronze blades beside a shaded wall while sparks flickered briefly into the sunlight. Everywhere, hands moved. Lifting. Sorting. Cleaning. Counting. Repairing. The ordinary work of survival filled every corner of the ancient city. Back inside the temple, Hori finally reached a small resting chamber near the rear courtyard where several overnight workers slept during daylight hours. Thin mats covered the floor beside the walls. A narrow opening near the ceiling allowed cooler air to drip through. Two servants already slept deeply nearby. One snored softly with an arm across his face. The other still wore flour dust upon his clothing from kitchen work. Hori lowered himself slowly onto an empty mat. His muscles ached from climbing stairs and carrying oil through the long night. The stone floor beneath the woven mat felt surprisingly cool against his tired body. Outside the chamber, temple life continued steadily. Water jars scraped against stone. Sandals crossed the corridors. Someone laughed briefly in a distant courtyard. Somewhere a hammer struck metal with slow measured rhythm. Yet here in the dim room, exhaustion wrapped around him almost instantly. Before sleep fully arrived, he listened quietly to the fading sounds of the temple. The lamps would still be burning somewhere deep within the sanctuary halls. Workers would still be tending kitchens and storerooms. Priests would still be moving through rituals beneath painted ceilings. The great temple breathed onward whether he slept or woke. That thought comforted him strangely. Outside, sunlight climbed higher over the Nile Valley. Heat spread slowly across the fields. Farmers bent over wet soil while birds circled overhead. Fishermen repaired torn nets beside the docks. Children carried baskets through dusty roads. And hidden within the cool stone heart of the temple, small oil lamps continued glowing softly against the ancient walls while tired workers drifted briefly into sleep before another long night would come again. By the middle of the morning, the coolness of dawn had almost completely disappeared from the Nile Valley. Sunlight spread heavily across the city now, bright and sharp against the pale stone walls and dusty roads. The rooftops that had felt pleasant during the night slowly warmed beneath the growing heat. Market cloths hung motionless in the still air while flies gathered thickly around baskets of fish and fruit. The day had fully begun. Along the riverbanks, laborers carried heavy jars from boats toward storage buildings. Their bare feet pressed into damp mud darkened by spilled water and crushed reeds. Men shouted short instructions while ropes creaked against wooden docks. Nearby, children gathered fallen grain one handful at a time before it disappeared into the dust. The Nile itself glittered beneath the sun. From a distance the water looked calm and beautiful, but life upon the river demanded exhausting work. Boatmen strained against poles and oars. Fishermen repaired torn nets with aching fingers. Women carried water jars up steep banks beneath unbearable heat. Every task required effort beneath the burning Egyptian sky. Inside the temple resting chamber, Hori slept deeply despite the growing warmth outside. His breathing remained slow and heavy. One arm rested across his forehead while faint light entered through the narrow opening above. Around him, the other sleeping workers barely moved except to turn occasionally upon the woven mats. The room smelled softly of dust, sweat, oil, and warm stone. These brief hours of daytime sleep mattered greatly for those who worked through the night. Without them, the body weakened quickly. Yet true rest remained difficult inside crowded ancient cities where noise, heat, insects, and labor surrounded nearly every moment of life. Outside the chamber, the temple corridors carried steady movement now. Servants crossed courtyards carrying baskets of bread and vegetables toward the kitchens. Priests moved between sanctuaries with fresh incense and folded linen garments. Scribes sat beneath shaded walls recording deliveries while wiping sweat from their necks with cloth strips. And deep within the darker halls, the lamps still burned. Not all of them. Many outer lamps had already been extinguished after sunrise. But inside the innermost chambers where sunlight never reached, small flames continued glowing beside sacred statues and painted shrines. Nebumun tended them carefully one by one. The old caretaker moved more slowly during daytime heat. His knees troubled him badly now, especially after long nights without proper rest. Still, his hands remained steady while trimming wicks and replenishing oil. He paused often beside the sanctuary walls. Sometimes simply to rest. Sometimes to listen. The deeper temple chambers carried a silence unlike any other place in the city. Even during busy daylight hours, thick stone walls softened outside sounds into distant murmurs. Here the air remained cooler. Shadows lingered beneath towering ceilings painted dark blue with tiny golden stars. The lamps flickered gently against those painted heavens overhead. Nebumun had watched these same flames for most of his life. As a young servant he once believed the temple would never change at all. The routines felt eternal. The walls permanent. The labor endless and unshifting. But slowly, year after year, he noticed changes. Workers disappeared and new faces arrived. Flood levels rose differently. Some harvests failed. Certain walls cracked and required repair. Paint faded little by little beneath smoke and time. Even the temple changed eventually, though so slowly that younger workers hardly noticed. He adjusted another lamp wick carefully. The tiny flame brightened again. Outside the sanctuary chamber, two younger servants carried large water jars suspended from a wooden pole balanced across their shoulders. Sweat darkened their linen clothing despite the early hour. The jars sloshed softly while they crossed the corridor toward the kitchens. Water shaped every hour of Egyptian life. Without constant carrying, storing, pouring, and lifting, entire households and temples would stop functioning almost immediately. Families needed water for cooking, washing, drinking, and making bread. Workers needed it beneath the fields and construction sites. Temple gardens depended upon careful irrigation. Even the lamps required water sometimes for cleaning soot-blackened bowls and bronze stands. Much of ancient labor involved simply moving heavy things from one place to another beneath the heat. Water, stone, wood, grain, oil, clay. The body became the machine for every task. By midday, the heat outside grew fierce. The roads shimmered beneath the sunlight. Dogs searched desperately for shade beneath market tables and carts. Laborers wrapped wet cloth around their heads while carrying bricks and baskets through the glaring brightness. Farmers in the distant fields bent silently above irrigation ditches while insects swarmed around wet soil and reeds. The mud beneath their feet baked slowly beneath the sun. Sweat rolled constantly into their eyes and mouths. Many worked nearly naked from the waist up during the hottest hours. Children carried water jars between the workers while trying to avoid the sharpest sunlight. One farmer named Intef straightened his back slowly and stared toward the river in exhaustion. His shoulders burned from hours spent clearing blocked irrigation channels with a wooden shovel. Mud coated his legs almost to the knees. Nearby, his oldest son continued packing loose earth against the canal wall to stop leaks before precious water escaped. Neither complained. The work simply needed doing. Ancient Egypt depended entirely upon such endless physical effort. The temples could not shine without fields. The fields could not survive without water. The water could not reach crops without laborers. Everything connected together beneath the relentless sun. Back in the city, market activity slowed somewhat during the hottest part of the day. Merchants sat beneath shade cloths fanning themselves lazily while waiting for customers. Some dozed beside baskets of dates or onions. Others drank watered beer slowly from clay cups while dust drifted through the roads. The air smelled thick and dry now. Hot stone. Animal sweat. Fish. Smoke. Spilled beer. Sun-baked mud brick. Even breathing felt heavy during these afternoon hours. Inside the temple kitchens, however, the heat became almost unbearable. Tia worked beside the ovens shaping dough while sweat dripped from her chin onto the stone floor. Fires roared loudly inside the clay chambers. Smoke gathered near the ceiling despite open vents cut high into the walls. Several younger workers moved sluggishly now from exhaustion. One boy nearly dropped a basket of bread before catching it awkwardly against his chest. No one scolded him. Everyone inside the kitchens understood how difficult the heat could become. Tia paused briefly beside a water jar and pressed cool fingers against the back of her neck. Her hair clung damply against her skin. The air around the oven seemed almost impossible to breathe some afternoons. Yet the bread still needed baking. Workers still needed feeding. The temple still consumed enormous amounts of food each day. Nearby, a temple cat slept stretched across a patch of cooler floor beside stacked grain sacks, completely undisturbed by the noise and heat around it. Outside the kitchens, a narrow shaded passage led toward the inner sanctuaries where the air cooled noticeably again. Here the lamps continued burning quietly in the darkness. Nebumun sat upon a low stool trimming wicks while resting his swollen knees. For a while he simply listened to the sounds carried faintly through the stone halls. Distant market voices beyond the outer walls. The crackle of kitchen fires. Sandals brushing the floor. A pigeon fluttering somewhere above the courtyards. Then silence again. He had come to love these quieter moments over the years. Not because life became easy inside the temple. It never did. But because the lamps created small islands of calm within the endless movement of labor and heat. Their flames asked nothing dramatic from the world. Only patience. Only care. Only enough oil to survive another few hours of darkness. Perhaps people were not so different. Near the rear courtyard, Hori finally stirred awake from sleep. At first he did not move. He simply listened while the sounds of daytime slowly returned to him. Workers passing outside. Water splashing into jars. Someone laughing faintly in the distance. The low murmur of temple activity continuing without pause. His body still felt terribly tired. Sleep during daylight never seemed deep enough. Heat and noise always hovered nearby, pulling the mind half awake even during rest. Still, he knew evening beauties would return soon enough. Already sunlight entering through the ceiling opening had begun changing colors slightly. The afternoon would not last forever. Soon shadows would lengthen again. The heat would soften. The lamps would become important once more. Hori sat up slowly and rubbed dust from his face. Nearby, another servant still slept heavily with one hand curled beneath his head. Outside the chamber, a breeze drifted faintly through the corridor carrying the smell of warm stone and distant river water. For a moment Hori remained seated quietly. He thought about the temple roofs beneath the stars. The flickering lamps beside painted walls. The endless river moving through darkness. Sometimes he wondered whether the city itself ever truly changed from one generation to the next. Children became workers. Workers became old caretakers. Then new children arrived to repeat the same labor beneath the same sun beside the same river. The temples endured through all of it. Their lamps burned through every season. Every flood. Every harvest. Every quiet ancient night. Outside, the afternoon slowly continued across the Nile Valley. Farmers bent over fields beneath the brutal heat. Fishermen repaired nets beneath shaded docks. Women washed clothing beside the riverbanks. Children carried baskets through dusty streets. And deep inside the cool stone heart of the temple, small flames still flickered softly in the darkness while weary workers prepared themselves for another long evening beside the Nile River. As the long afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the city beside the Nile seemed to exhale beneath the fading heat. The sunlight remained strong, but its harshness softened little by little. Shadows stretched longer across the roads. Market sellers lifted tired eyes toward the western sky where pale gold had begun gathering above the desert hills. The worst part of the day was nearly over. Laborers felt it first in their bodies. Stone workers loosened aching shoulders and leaned briefly against unfinished walls. Farmers straightened slowly from irrigation ditches and wiped mud from their arms. Boatmen resting beside the docks splashed water across their faces while watching sunlight flicker upon the river. Even the animals seemed relieved. Donkeys lowered their heads quietly beneath the gentler air. Dogs emerged from beneath carts and shaded walls. Birds returned to the reeds near the riverbanks. And through the crowded streets, the smell of evening cooking fires slowly began spreading once more. Inside the temple, the great stone halls cooled gradually after the crushing heat of midday. Warm air still lingered beneath the ceilings, but the shadows deepened again between the columns and sanctuary walls. Workers moved with slightly more energy now that breathing no longer felt so difficult. Hori crossed one courtyard carrying empty oil jars toward the storerooms. Sleep had helped him somewhat, though exhaustion still lived deep inside his muscles. The rough clay pressed against his arms while dust shifted beneath his sandals. Nearby, several younger servants swept fallen leaves and sand into piles beside the garden walls. One boy paused repeatedly to rub his eyes. Another quietly hummed to himself while working. The temple breathed differently during these hours before sunset. Daytime noise softened. Voices lowered. The frantic movement of midday slowed into calmer rhythms. Soon the lamps would need preparing again. Nebamun already sat beside a low table sorting fresh linen strips for wicks. His old fingers moved carefully through the folded cloth while nearby bowls of oil waited in silence. A bronze knife rested beside him for trimming burned wick ends from the previous night. Hori approached quietly and began helping without needing instructions. Their work moved almost wordlessly now. Cut the linen. Twist the fibers gently. Place finished wicks into small clay trays. Check oil levels. Clean soot from lamp rims. The routines had repeated so many times they no longer required much conversation. Outside the temple walls, evening life awakened across the city. Children ran barefoot through dusty streets before darkness arrived. Women sat beside doorways preparing vegetables while neighbors exchanged quiet conversations nearby. Fresh bread cooled upon woven mats. The smell of fish cooking over open flames drifted upward between the narrow homes. Families slowly climbed toward rooftops again carrying blankets and water jars for the coming night. The rooftops became important after sunset. During hotter months, many people preferred sleeping beneath open skies where cooler winds crossed the city from the river. Entire families gathered together there after evening meals. Elderly relatives rested beside sleeping children while stars slowly emerged overhead. An old woman named Henut sat upon one rooftop now weaving reed mats beside her daughter. Below them, street noise drifted upward softly through the warm evening air. Henut's hands moved slowly from age, though years of weaving had taught them steady patience. The reeds brushed gently against one another while she worked. Nearby, a clay lamp waited unlit beside folded blankets for later in the night. From this rooftop she could see part of the temple rising above the city. Soon its lamps would begin glowing again. She had watched that same evening light appear since childhood. During years of good harvests. During seasons of sickness. During floods that rose frighteningly high along the riverbanks. The temple lamps always returned with nightfall. Their quiet glow comforted people more than they often realized. Along the Nile shoreline, fishermen prepared once again for the long dark hours upon the water. Nets dried earlier in the day were checked carefully for damage. Small boats drifted gently against their moorings while the current pulled steadily southward. Mena stood beside his boat sharpening a bronze hook with slow strokes against smooth stone. His younger brother untangled rope nearby while evening birds crossed overhead. The air smelled cooler now. Wet reeds. River mud. Smoke from distant cooking fires. The scent carried memories for him older than words themselves. He had learned fishing from his father beside these same waters. Long before sunrise they would push boats into darkness while stars still reflected upon the river surface. Long after sunset they returned with aching backs and roughened hands carrying whatever the Nile chose to provide. Some nights were generous. Others nearly empty. Yet the river always called them back again. Farther inland, temple kitchens prepared the evening meal for workers remaining overnight inside the complex. Tia stirred lentils slowly inside a clay pot while another baker stacked fresh bread nearby. The worst heat had passed from the ovens now, leaving only deep lingering warmth within the walls. Kitchen workers relaxed slightly during these evening hours. Some shared quiet conversation while cleaning tools and bowls. Others simply sat silently beside the doorway letting cooler air touch sweat-soaked skin. A young helper carried water between the kitchens and nearby courtyards while trying not to spill the heavy jars. His arms trembled visibly from fatigue. Still, he continued carefully because dropping a jar meant more than embarrassment. Water mattered too much. Everything inside the temple depended upon careful labor. As the sun lowered farther toward the western desert, long golden light entered the outer courtyards between the columns. Dust floated brightly through the air. Birds settled along roof edges while palm leaves rustled softly in the evening breeze. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the shadows deepened once more. The lamps returned. Hori lit the first one inside a narrow sanctuary corridor where darkness gathered early each evening. He lowered a tiny flame toward the fresh linen wick and watched the oil catch gently. A warm circle of light appeared against the stone. Then another lamp beside it. Then another farther down the hall. One by one the temple awakened into nighttime again. The transformation always felt peaceful to him. Daylight belonged to labor and heat. Night belonged to quieter things. The lamps softened the stone halls. Their glow made even familiar corridors seem older and calmer. Painted walls flickered gently with moving shadows. Bronze surfaces reflected warm gold across the darkness. Workers instinctively lowered their voices after the lamps were lit. The temple itself seemed to ask for silence. Nebumun carried fresh oil through one sanctuary while Hori followed behind replacing older lamps that had cracked from long use. Some clay bowls had burned night after night for many years before finally splitting from heat. Nothing lasted forever. Not lamps. Not walls. Not people. Yet the routines continued beyond any single life. Inside a deep chamber near the center of the temple, several priests arranged evening offerings beneath flickering light. Bread. Fruit. Flowers. Incense. Small cups of beer. The smell of incense drifted upward through the dark air while one priest murmured prayers softly. Outside the chamber, Hori waited quietly holding extra oil. His eyelids already felt heavy again despite the earlier sleep. Night work demanded strange endurance. The body wanted darkness for rest, yet the temple required wakefulness through the silent hours. Some workers adapted over time. Others never truly did. Still, there could be beauty in the night labor too. The temple after sunset felt separate from the crowded world outside. Cooler. Slower. Wrapped in silence and flickering light. Near the outer gates, guards lit larger lamps mounted upon stone walls overlooking the roads toward the river. Travelers arriving after dark would see the glow from a distance beyond the houses and market streets. A caravan of merchants entered the city now with tired donkeys loaded beneath woven bundles. Dust coated their clothing from long travel beside the river roads. The guards inspected them briefly before allowing passage toward the evening markets and lodging houses. Travel never truly stopped along the Nile. Boats moved constantly. Caravans crossed between settlements. Messengers carried records, goods, and news from city to city. The river connected countless lives together through trade and labor. And always, above the shoreline and crowded roads, the temples watched quietly with their lamps glowing through the darkness. Night settled fully at last. The final sunlight disappeared beyond the western desert hills. Cooler winds moved gently across the courtyards. Stars emerged overhead one by one. From nearby rooftops came the faint sound of families talking softly before sleep. Somewhere a baby cried briefly before falling silent again. Dogs barked in the distance near the riverbanks. Inside the temple, workers prepared for another long ancient night. Hori climbed the familiar staircase toward the rooftop shrines carrying a fresh oil jar against his shoulder. Behind him, the sanctuary halls flickered warmly beneath hundreds of tiny flames. Ahead of him, the stars stretched endlessly above the Nile Valley. The night had begun again. The night settled softly over the Nile River one final time. The lamps inside the temple burned low now, their flames smaller and quieter than before. Thin ribbons of smoke drifted upward through the dark halls where the last footsteps of the workers slowly faded into silence. Oil rested still inside the clay bowls. Shadows lay gently across the stone floors worn smooth by countless years of patient labor. Outside, the river moved beneath the stars without hurry. Fishing boats drifted quietly near the reeds. Palm trees swayed softly in the cool night wind. Far across the dark water, small household lamps glimmered faintly upon the rooftops where tired families slept beneath linen blankets after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. The city itself seemed half asleep. Bread ovens cooled into ash. Market roads emptied. Donkeys rested beside silent walls. Children dreamed quietly beneath the stars. And inside the great temple, the caretakers finished tending the final lamps of the night. Hori stood once more beneath the painted ceilings where tiny golden stars shimmered faintly above him in the flickering light. His hands smelled of oil and smoke. Dust clung softly to his sandals after so many long walks through the corridors. Nearby, Nebamun lowered himself slowly onto a stone bench beside one glowing lamp. His old eyes reflected the flame for a moment while silence gathered gently around them both. No one spoke. There was nothing left that needed saying. The temple breathed softly in the darkness. Warm stone. Fading incense. Quiet air drifting through hidden passageways. The endless calm of routines repeated across generations beside the river. Beyond the sanctuary walls, the Nile continued its slow journey through the sleeping land just as it had for thousands of years. Floodwaters would rise again. Farmers would return to the fields. Bakers would light their ovens before dawn. Fishermen would cast nets beneath the moonlight. And somewhere, deep inside the ancient temples of Egypt, small oil lamps would continue glowing patiently against the dark. One flame after another. Soft and steady. Until morning returned once more. The wind moved gently through the temple courtyard. Palm leaves rustled overhead. A final lamp flickered quietly beside the silent stone walls. And little by little, beneath the endless stars beside the Nile River, the ancient world drifted peacefully into sleep.